Hello, welcome to Sprouting Storytime. I am noticing that a lot of you know me. I have been in many of your classes. I'm super excited to have the UCLA Lab School teachers that are on the Zoom live. If you're watching this on YouTube later on, that's also great. But my name is Antonio Sacre. I am a storyteller. I am the storyteller in residence at the Lab School on the campus of UCLA, a beautiful place where I've learned a lot about reading and writing. But I travel all around the country via Zoom now, and we have about 15 different states. There are students and teachers from 15 different states around the country. Welcome. I'm going to tell you a couple of my favorite stories to celebrate El Día de los Niños, El Día de los Libros. If you speak Spanish, you know what language I am talking. It's Spanish. This month, we celebrate the Day of the Child and the Day of the Book. And so I wanted to talk about my favorite activity, which is eating ice cream, and my second favorite activity, which is swimming in the pool. But my third favorite activity is reading. Whenever kids around the country ask me how I became an author, there's really one answer. And that answer is, I love to read. Every morning. Do you know what I do? I read and I read and I read and I read. And then I tell stories. And when I get to lunchtime and I'm eating, if I'm not eating with a teacher or a friend, do you know what I do? I read and I read and I read and I read. And at night, I read out loud to my own children. I have a 13-year-old child and a 10-year-old child. And then once they're in bed, you're never going to guess what I do. I read and I read and I read and I read. I read all the time. I wanted to share with you what I read. In the morning, I read one of 4 different magazines. I love National Geographic magazine, so sometimes I read about this. I love the Smithsonian Museum, so sometimes I read their magazine. One of my friends loves Harper's, and he lets me borrow his magazine, so I read that. And my wife loves the New Yorker, so I read that magazine. So in the morning, I'm reading one of those 4 magazines. At lunchtime, I love to read fiction. And now I'm reading this beautiful book by Julia Alvarez. She's from the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is not too far from Cuba, where my father is from. And so I wanted to read fiction about the Dominican Republic. And at night, I read nonfiction. Why do I read so many different types of literature and magazines and nonfiction and poetry? Oh, I forgot to share with you. I also read stories, Grimm stories, Swedish stories, Arabian Nights stories. I also love to read comic books. This is Calvin and Hobbes. I love reading Calvin and Hobbes books. Why did I become such a reader? When I was younger, my mom would take us to the library and she would say, you're only allowed to take as many books as you can carry. As many books as I can carry, as many books as you can carry, and not one more. And so I would go to the library and I would get as many books as I could carry. Now, when I take my children to the library, do you know what I say to them? You're only allowed to carry as many books as you can carry. And just last night, my daughter and I went to the library, and this is the stack of books that she could carry. She reads all kinds of books. She reads in English. She reads in Spanish. She reads nonfiction. She reads fiction. And that is a thing that I love to talk about. Well, a long time ago, when I first moved to this neighborhood where I live in Los Angeles, I was walking around my neighborhood and this little 4-year-old girl, she came up to me. She said, hey, who are you? I said, who are you? She said, I'm Tessa. Who are you? I said, I'm Antonio. She says, what do you do? I said, I'm walking around the neighborhood. I said, what do you do? She says, I read. You read? Yeah, I read. Do you read? I said, Tessa, I read. You don't read as much as I read. I don't know, Tessa. I read a lot. Oh, yeah? Well, I read a book called Make Way for Ducklings. Make Way for Ducklings? That's one of my favorite books. As a matter of fact, let me see. Here it is. I have it right here. Make Way for Ducklings. I love this book. Tessa, you love Make Way for Ducklings? I do. I said, where'd you get it? She said, the library. Do you know about the library? You can get books at the library. I said, oh, Tessa, I do know about the library. I love the library. And she said, have you been to the library? And this is what I said to my 4-year-old neighbor, Tessa, many years ago. Tessa, I just came back from the library. And when I was at the library, I saw a chicken walking into the library, going up to the librarian. And the chicken said, book. And the librarian said, oh, you want a book? So the librarian got a book and gave it to the chicken. Tessa said, that happened? I said, I'm not done the story, Tessa. Well, the chicken balanced the book on its little head and walked out of the library. I looked at the librarian. I said, Miss Hillary, have you ever seen that? She says, oh, all kinds of people and animals come to the library to get books. About an hour later, the chicken came back in, walked up to Mrs. Hillary and said, book. And Mrs. Hillary said, oh, you want 2 books? And so she gave 2 books to that chicken. The chicken put one under one wing, one under the other thing, and the chicken waddled out with the 2 books under its wings. I said, Miss Hillary, have you ever seen something like that? And Tessa said, did that really happen? I said, Tessa, I'm not done the story. Because the chicken came back a little while later, and the chicken said, book. And Miss Hillary said, oh, you want 3 books? So Miss Hillary gave 2 books for the chicken to hold underneath its wings, 1 book for the head, and the chicken started to waddle out. And I decided to follow that chicken. And I did. I followed that chicken down the steps of the library. I pushed the walk button and it crossed the street and it walked down to the LA River, not too far from the library I love to go. And down at the river, it threw the books on the side of the river. And a frog jumped out. And the frog looked at those books and the frog said, read it, read it, read it. Tessa said, that didn't happen. And I said, but Miss Hillary gave me a book called The Chicken. And that is an actual picture book you can get of the chicken that went to the library. Well, when Tessa turned 5 years old, she went to a local school near my house. And she told the teacher at that school that she knew a guy who told silly jokes. And the teacher said, Tessa, can you bring that guy that tells silly jokes into the classroom? And so many years ago, I went into that classroom and I began to tell stories in Tessa's classroom. And Tessa got older and older and older. And every year I told stories in her classroom. And when she was about 10 years old, I wrote this story for her that I want to share with you. Tessa loved to read. Every Friday after school, she'd sprint to her favorite place, the library. Zoom, she ran fast. Miss Hillary would help her pick out 9 books that were just right for her. Just right books, Miss Hillary said, and 1 book that was totally not right for her. And Tessa would stack those up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right under her chin, and she would take those books home and she would read and 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 read. And then she would stack those red books up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 wedged under her chin and take those back to the library to Miss Hillary. One holiday weekend, Tessa decided she was going to bring home 200 books. If she could only carry 10 books at a time, how many trips did she need to make to the library to come back with 200 books. Third graders, you can do that math. Kindergartners, ask your teacher to Google it. Hey, Google, how many books would it take? The answer is 20 trips. When she got home, she had 200 books, and she lined them all up carefully on the bookshelf next to her bed. And she sat down and she did her favorite thing. She pulled out the book and she read it and read it and read it. And the book was so good and so exciting that instead of placing it carefully back on the shelf, she just threw it on the floor and grabbed another book. And she read and she read and she read, and the books piled up on the floor, but she just kept reading. And the books piled up to her bed, but she just kept reading. And the books piled up to her shoulders, but she just kept reading. And the books piled up to her chin. And Tessa saw that she only had 10 books left, but she couldn't stop reading. And she just kept reading until the last book covered Tessa. And she was completely buried in books. Her mom came home and said, Tessa, no answer. Her dad came home and said, Tessa, no answer. Her little feisty sister Eden came home and said, Tessa, no answer. Dad went upstairs. He opened up Tessa's bedroom door and he saw that his daughter was buried in books. His mom said, what are you crying? Her mom said, what are you crying about? And the mom came up. She said, oh no, it finally happened. Tessa is buried in books. And little Eden, the little tiny feisty sister, she said, what are you crying about, Dad? What are you crying about, Mom? And they said, your sister is buried in books. And Tessa, little Eden said, yes, house to myself. And the dad said, that's not right. We need to save your sister. And the mom said, we need to save your sister. And Eden said, let's leave her be buried for just a little bit longer. And the dad said, there's only one way to the bottom of this pile of books. And Dad grabbed a book and he sat in the hallway and he began to read it. And Mom grabbed a book and she sat in the hallway and she began to read it. And Eden eventually grabbed a book and she began to read it. And soon that family was able to uncover Tessa, where there she was holding the last book. And she said, Dad, Mom, Eden, bury me in books again. And Dad said, Tessa. Why not, Dad? It's Eden's turn. And Eden and Tessa and her mom and dad are buried in books to this day. That is a slightly true story inspired by one of the readers in my neighborhood who is now 18 years old. We're still friends. And this past summer, Tessa went to a summer reading camp where for 3 weeks she sat in a college room, a college classroom with a bunch of other high school seniors, and they spent 3 weeks reading at a summer reading camp. And I'm happy to say that I was there to see her become a reader when she was 4 years old. I have one last little story to share with you, students. And then teachers, I'm going to teach a quick 5-minute poetry writing workshop that I love. If you are able to stay, that would be great. If you are, and I will share with you what I love to teach. But the last little story I have has to do with when I was about 7 years old. I think some of you are 7 years old. Some of you used to be 7. Some of you may one day be 7. When I was 7, I loved to read. I'm going to share with you. I think I have them here. I love to read comic books. Comic books were super fun. I read Peanuts. This was written a long time ago. I don't think any of you know what Peanuts is. Actually, you know what? It's the complete Peanuts. This was one of the first ones from 1953, way, way long ago. I would read comic books. I loved Peanuts. And then I discovered Garfield. How many of you have ever read the Garfield comic books? I love Garfield. And that led me to Graphic novels. I know a lot of you love it, and I want to share with you one of my favorites. Oh my goodness, kiddos. This is an amazing book, Roller Girl by Victoria Jameson. She also wrote another beautiful book called When Stars Are Scattered and another beautiful book called All's Fair. And so I moved sort of from Garfield comics and Peanuts comics to graphic novels, and I loved reading those books. There are about 6,552 million Garfield books. There is a little bit fewer Peanuts books, and there's tons of graphic novels. Well, one day, my teacher said to my mom, "Your son Antonio is only reading comic books. He should be reading a whole bunch of other stuff." And my mom said, "He's reading what he wants to read. He's never going to get smart if he doesn't read hard nonfiction and history and all kinds of other things." And my mom said, "As long as he's reading, I'm happy." And so I would go to the library, and all those books that I would stack up often were Peanuts books or Garfield books or other comic books as well. And one day, the smartest kid in third grade was at the library with me. And I said, "Chris, you're smart." He says, "Well, I don't know." I said, "How did you get so smart?" He said, "I like to read." I said, "I like to read." He says, "Oh, well, that's good. That's one way to help you get smarter." But I looked at the books he was reading. He had read Garfield as well and Peanuts and some of the graphic novels that I liked, but he also had some nonfiction books. He had some biography books. He had some autobiography books. He had a book about science. He had a book about poetry. He had a book that was in another language. "You speak Spanish too?" "Yeah, I love to read in Spanish. It helps me practice my Spanish." I looked at all of those books. He had some books that were super fun, some books that were super interesting, some books that looked really boring, and a couple books in another language. "Chris, by reading those books, that's how you got smarter?" He says, "I don't know how I got smarter. Some people said it's because my head is so big." "Yeah, Chris, you got a big head." Chris had a big head. I said, "But you read that." So what I started to do is I still love to read these books. I still read comic books and I still read graphic novels, but I also throw in some nonfiction books and some books of poetry and some books about history and some books about people I know and people I don't know and people I want to know. The last book I want to share with you is this. Now, kids, you don't know what this book is. It's called a dictionary. How many of you have a dictionary in your classroom? I know you have a phone or a computer in your classroom, but how many of you actually have a dictionary in your classroom? Let me see. I'm looking around at some of these classes around the country. Not so many dictionaries. Teachers and students, I always read with a dictionary next to me. I have my phone with me for sure, and the phone is faster. If I want to find out what a word means, my phone finds it right away. But if I don't know what a word is and I look it up in the dictionary, do you know what happens? I always find a different word next to the word I'm looking for. Today, I had to look up a word called striation. Striation. Striation, I looked it up and I found striation. Something that has a bunch of striates in it. What's that mean? I had to look up striates, and then I found the word startle. That's a good word. And then I found the word sturgeon. What's a sturgeon? And I began to learn new words today, looking up one word I didn't know because of the dictionary. Which leads me to the poetry writing exercise I want to share with you. Teachers, in about 4 or 5 minutes, you can start throwing questions in the chat if you're on with me live. I love to answer some of those questions by the end of the last 5 minutes of my session. And also, you're going to get a recording of this so you can sort of enjoy this. When I read poetry, which I do often, I am struck by the lots of tools that poets use when they write poems. One of the tools that poets use when they write poems is alliteration. You students over 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, you know what alliteration is. And kindergartners know what alliteration is, but they may not know it specifically. Alliteration is when a bunch of words all start with the same letter. So I think about a way of teaching alliteration. You, of course, could read poems where there's alliteration, where you can have examples, or you can do this. What I do is I think about the alphabet and I choose a random letter in the alphabet. Now, sometimes I go through the whole entire alphabet. I do that in my journal. I'll start with A, and then I give myself 60 seconds to write as many words that start with the letter A as I can. And when my 60-second timer goes off, I have a list of words that start with the letter A. So maybe I've got apple, 8, aardvark. What else starts with the letter A? I can't think of any word. Antonio, my name. Anteater. Adjective. Around. Then I look in the dictionary for 60 seconds and find a bunch of words that start with the letter A that I didn't know already. So let me see. Let's see what I got here. Allegedly. Allude. Alpha wave. Ammonesis. Amaranth. So now I have a bunch of words that I just learned. Now, I just did it this morning with the letter S. I gave myself 60 seconds and I came up with this list of words that start with the letter S. Sad, silly, soup, sumptuous, stranded, slip, slop, stupendous, slimy, strawberry, stop, stegosaurus, slow, spy, and slump. Then my 60-second timer went off. So I had a list of interesting words that start with the letter S. Then I went to the dictionary and tried to find a word that I didn't know that started with the letter S. And I came up with the word striation, which is a series of marks. Striation is a series of marks. Kiddos, when you get home, tell your mom or dad, hey, mom or dad, don't put striations in my toast tonight. And now I've got a list of words that took me about 60 seconds to write. I spent about 30 seconds in the dictionary to find a word I didn't know, striation, and then I put it all together with a sentence that teaches alliteration. So here it is. The sad, slow stegosaurus spied some stranded soup by the strawberry, stopped, and slurped it up. I used the list of words that started with the letter S. I found a word I didn't know, and I put it together in a sentence. The sad, slow stegosaurus spied some stranded soup by the strawberry, stopped, and slurped it up. That's alliteration, when you have a letter that starts a bunch of words in a row. Teachers, the way I use this exercise, I use it as a transition exercise in between things that I'm doing. So I'll just say, all right, kids, your ticket to recess is to spend 30 seconds writing down as many words that start with the letter B as you can. And then find one word in the dictionary that you didn't know that starts with the letter B. Bonus points, make it into some silly sentence, and now you're off to recess. And sometimes I get through the whole entire alphabet. The letter Z only has a few words. Z is pretty hard. Zebra. What else is Z? I can't even think about them. Zeal, that's a good word. Here we go. Zeitgeist. The letter X is a little bit hard and the vowels are hard to do, but the consonants are really fun to put it together. All right, teachers, if you have any questions from kids to throw in the chat, you're welcome to do that right now. The last 5 minutes of the Zoom is me just answering chat questions from around the country if you have them. So if you would like to do that, you can throw a question or two in the chat for me. I'm seeing many teachers that have had me in your classes. I'm so glad that you have me back here in your Zoom. Teachers, I do this every month. I'm going to do one more Zoom for the end of the school year in May. After this Zoom is over, I will send you an email link, which will include information on how to reach me, which is very easy, just my website, antoniosacri.com. And you can reach me there. And I will also send you, oh, that's so interesting. Do I have a picture of Tessa? You know what? I do, because we're friends, and there's my family and her family hang out together a lot. I won't share her picture though, because that's not something I do necessarily. But Tessa is an amazing reader, and because of all of her reading, she's also become a writer as well. So I said that at the very beginning of the chat, that the way I became a writer is by reading, and that's true. And teachers and parents, I do want to say this, that if your kids are only reading if they're only reading these things, it's okay. At some point, they're going to get excited about other books as well. The schools I work with, I know that they are full of all the different kinds of books that are there. Room 15 and Salon 13, you're amazing. Thank you so much. The lab school teachers that were on, I miss all of you. I'm working at the lab school this spring, but I'm working with the older kids. So stop and say hello when you see me walking around there. Let's see. Oh, if you're in the Los Angeles area, I'm doing a lot of library appearances starting this week. I have a library appearance in Los Angeles this week to celebrate Dia de los Niños, Dia de los Libros, and a bunch of library appearances this summer as well. Thank you for coming so much. I see some other schools I work with. I really, really appreciate it. If there's other questions, you can reach out to me, but all have a great day. Thank you all so very much. I'm so glad you were there, Maestra Torres. De nada. Gracias por estar aquí conmigo. Adiós. Gracias, Whittier. That's awesome you were here. Thank you so much. Maine was here, North Carolina, Chicago, Delaware. I'm so glad you all were here. Happy reading. Happy Dia de los Niños. Happy Dia de los Libros. And I'll see you next week.